All right, we'll begin while other people join in. So hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining and welcome. This is the second day of the Rethinking, sorry, my bad. Day 3 of the Rethinking Economics India Network's 2021 annual event, Dialogues on Economic Realities. The theme for today is Better Economics for Climate Change and Biodiversity. But before we get into the session and I hand over to our moderator and our panelists for today to talk more about the session, I would just like to take a minute or two to talk to you about what this event is and who the Rethinking Economics India Network is. I am Jaya Jain. I am one of the conveners of the Rethinking Economics India Network. And this network we started amidst this pandemic. We started last year in June 2020, and we are the national network of the global rethinking economics movement. We work towards promoting pluralist, alternate, and new economic thinking in India, and we want the society and all the key stakeholders, individuals, universities, private and public sector players, to participate in a scalable and collaborative effort to learn, to teach, and to discuss pathways for building a better economy for India and to a certain extent the global South. This particular annual event, which is spread over 2 weekends of September 24, 25, 26 and 1, 2, 3 of October, marks the culmination of delivering numerous focused deliberations and projects within the domain of heterodox, pluralist, new and alternate economic thinking in India. We are aiming to bring together voices from students, from youth-led organizations, from academics, from activists, to brainstorm and to think about ideas and solutions for reshaping our understanding and implementation of economic policies and theories. We are focusing on 4 major themes for this particular event: diversity and decolonizing economics, which was our theme for yesterday; better economics for climate change and biodiversity, which is our focus theme for today; global governance in the global South, which is what we're going to talk about on the 2nd of October, and curriculum reform in economics, which is going to be our closing theme for the 3rd of October. Today, as I mentioned already, we are focusing on better economics for climate change and biodiversity. And we have already had one session on this theme at 5:30 p.m. IST on better economics for climate change and worker well-being, where we talked about the intersection of climate change and its effects on the most vulnerable on the society, and what it would mean to make worker policies and working environment better and more conducive to climate change. Today, right now, we're going to have a session on big markets, money, and climate change. We have with us Tanya Martha Thomas and Ulrich Volz. I will now hand over to Tanya, who is our moderator for this session. She is project affairs officer with Climate Change, and also is pursuing at the same time her master's in environmental policy from the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po Paris. Over to you, Tanya. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, Jaya, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. So to get right on with the session, today's session is trying to focus on the nature of capital allocation in climate change. Focusing on the global South, we would like to understand the contextualization of the funding and implementation of climate infrastructure projects, various instruments of international financing for climate, and also to question the efficacy of market-based initiatives as solutions to climate change. So with us today, we have our panelist, Mr. Ulrich Volz, who is the director of the Center for Sustainable Finance and a professor of economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, the SOAS, the University of London. He is also a senior research fellow at the German Development Institute and honorary professor of economics at the University of Leipzig. Ulrich is a director of the Global Research Alliance for Sustainable Finance and Investment and serves on the advisory board of the International Sustainable Finance Center. He is currently advising the Brazilian Central Bank on developing an environmental and social risk analysis framework and has worked with the finance ministers of the 20 vulnerable countries on the ways to address macro financial risks stemming from climate change. He's the co-chair of the Debt Relief for Green and Inclusive Recovery Initiative. Ulrich was the lead author of a recent study on climate change and sovereign risk, as well as a 2018 UN report on climate change and the cost of capital in developing countries. He's the co-editor of the NGFS volume on case studies of environmental risk analysis methodologies and the Routledge Handbook of Banking and Finance in Asia. So without further ado, I'm going to head straight to the first question that we have for you, Ulrich, which is, drawing from your work, could you perhaps elaborate on the relationship between climate vulnerability and the cost of capital in the global South countries? And further, how does this affect these countries' internal macroeconomic stability?
Well, thanks a lot, Tanya, Jaya, for having me, and also the Rethinking Economics India network for organizing these events. In a previous life, I was head of the economics department at SOAS, University of London, where I also work very closely with the local chapter, which is called the SOAS Open Economics Forum. And I very much welcome and would like to support these kinds of initiatives, because it's really good to have critical students asking tough questions on what we do in economics, how we teach economics, and some rethinking can always be very helpful. But let me get to your question. So climate vulnerable countries face very considerable macro financial risks stemming from climate change, which are threatening debt sustainability, they worsen sovereign risk, and they harm investment and development prospects of these climate vulnerable countries. In 2018, we did a report for the UN, which you mentioned, where we were able to show for the very first time that climate vulnerable countries already now are paying a climate risk premium on the cost of their sovereign debt. So their debt service is higher than would otherwise be because of their climate vulnerability. And we were able to put some numbers to that. And we estimated that for a group of climate vulnerable countries, the additional cost of debt was 117 basis points. And this maybe sounds a bit technical, but that means that for every $10 that climate vulnerable countries spend on interest payment, they have to pay another dollar because they are climate vulnerable. And in that report, we estimated that a group of 40 climate vulnerable countries, which are mostly very small economies, they incurred an additional interest payment amounting to $40 billion over the previous decade on public external debt alone. And then if we also include external private debt, that would amount to more than $60 billion. So there are already very material impacts in terms of fiscal cost for climate vulnerable countries. And we have done some follow-up research. Our research has also been replicated by economists at the International Monetary Fund, which have corroborated this effect. And this is now basically being accepted. And the relevance is really very important. So a higher cost of capital for governments has huge implications on their fiscal space, on what they can invest in or not. And so a higher cost of capital is really making investment in resilience, which is so much needed in climate adaptation, but also any other development expenditures that we would like to see, such as health and so on, more expensive. So a higher cost of development is really undermining the future of these countries. And the sad truth is that countries that basically have not contributed to climate change are being punished twice. So they already face higher physical risk from climate change. So the global South experiencing on average, much more frequent and more intensive climate hazards. So they're already punished through that. And now they're also being punished by capital markets because these demand a higher risk premium. And so this is a serious problem. And it not only affects public finances, it also has implications for corporate finances. And we have been able in further studies to show that climate vulnerability is also driving up the cost of corporate capital. So the private sector is also being held back, and we do need private sector development, to advance our economies. So this is a really serious problem, and there are all kinds of macro financial vulnerabilities facing developing countries that can kind of worsen this problem. And the challenge is now that we have already a quite large group of climate vulnerable countries which have to pay this climate risk premium, and climate change is getting worse. So the risk is that these countries will end up in some kind of vicious circle where already now they're paying a higher cost of capital, which is holding back investment in climate resilience and so on. Climate change is getting worse, and this will then likely result in greater vulnerability, even higher cost of capital, and then you have this self-reinforcing vicious circle, which will undermine development and also public debt sustainability. And then, of course, you also have exposure of the economy and the financial sector. So if there's no investment in resilience and the economy is getting more vulnerable, the financial system is getting more vulnerable. So these vulnerabilities in the real economy, in the financial sector, and in government can then reinforce each other. And this is a very dangerous situation. So we really have an urgent need for countries to invest in resilience, and this is what we need to enable. And there are different things that could be done, that should be done, but for a lot of countries, this will not be something that they can just do by themselves. They will need international systems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for answering that. And on that vein, I'd like to pose the next question, which is more or less a follow-up to this. What policies or interventions concretely do you think global South economies should be prioritizing in order to address climate vulnerability assessments and promote investment in climate adaptation and to build resilience, as you were saying? And if I were to paraphrase it and put it more simply, what needs to change with the way things are being done currently?
Yeah, so I think the starting point is that we need comprehensive vulnerability assessments to really understand where are the major macro, not only physical risks and transition risks, but where are the major macro financial vulnerabilities facing economies. So we did research looking into the transmission channels of risk. So how can different physical impacts of climate change and transition impacts of climate change, that is changes to policies, either at home or in abroad, also technological change, change of consumer preference and so on, how can these transition impacts, in addition to the physical impacts, threaten economic development and undermine macro financial stability? And so for this, it would be important to look at different sectors of the economy, look also very importantly at longer time spans to understand where are the main risk drivers. And for this one would need to employ forward-looking scenario analysis. So with climate change, one of the big challenges is that looking at past data is of limited use, because climate change is happening, and it's not happening in a linear way. But climate change is characterized by tipping points, so where things can escalate, and that can have very dramatic effects on our societies, on our economies, and so on. So in this kind of comprehensive vulnerability assessment, which I think really has to be the starting point, we need to do this scenario-based analysis, and then and it's important that we involve different actors in the government in there. So we need the finance ministry, economics ministry, planning ministry, agriculture, tourism, but also central bank and supervisor. They all need to work together to do this comprehensive vulnerability assessment. And then based on that, there needs to be some kind of national climate risk adaptation plan. That would have to involve quite a lot of different dimensions. Certainly, we need governments to climate-proof public policy, public financial management. Finance ministries need to mainstream climate risk analysis in their policies. They need to kind of look at budgetary processes, where are climate risks, how to do contingency planning and all that kind of stuff. They need to look at debt management, and also look at kind of more innovative debt instruments. So, for example, Barbados has now introduced kind of debt instruments with disaster risk clauses. So if a disaster hits, then this will affect the repayment conditions to alleviate financial pressures. So that is one important area. We certainly need then also central banks and supervisors to adjust their prudential frameworks, also monetary frameworks, to account for climate risk. Because as I said, kind of the impacts on the economy will be then reflected in the financial sector. And there is a risk that physical and transition impacts on the economy will then undermine financial stability of the financial system. And this in turn could then lead to kind of instability of public finances, because as we've seen so many times, once the financial sector is in deep trouble, in one way or another, governments typically have to intervene to stabilize the financial sector, and that can drive up kind of financial, sovereign risk, and then there could be some kind of doom loop with worsening financial sector instability, growing sovereign risk, and so on. So we need to make sure that the financial system is kind of weatherproofed. But we not only need to climate-proof the financial system, we also need the financial system to increase investment in climate adaptation and resilience, and also help to develop insurance solutions. So and therefore, it's very important that governments and also financial authorities, central banks, work on financial sector policies that are aimed at helping the scale up of investment in climate adaptation and resilience. And so there are a lot of things that central banks and supervisors could be doing. To that, we can get back to that in the Q&A if you like. Also, for example, helping to develop insurance solutions can be an important step. It's not a silver bullet, but in many developing countries, you have a huge insurance gap. And having greater insurance cover can really help households, but also corporations to better cope with climate shocks. But then it's also very important, I think, to highlight that, especially for poorest and most vulnerable countries, we absolutely need international support. The climate risks facing, for example, small island states are so enormous, and the investment needs in adaptation resilience are very high. And many of these countries simply won't be able to, manage that by themselves. So we do need the international community to provide climate finance to really, help these countries adapt. And here I would like to emphasize that this has to be, this really should primarily be in the form of grants. So, it's not a big help if poor climate vulnerable countries have to take on huge debt to finance these crucial investments, which will then crowd out all kinds of other investment that they also would need to undertake, and increase the risk of sovereign debt crisis. So these countries have ended up in this position without fault of themselves. They have not caused the climate crisis. So it's absolutely an issue of global climate justice that rich countries that have historically caused all these emissions really provide the climate finance necessary to ramp up adaptation. And we have to say, unfortunately, that so there has been a commitment at the Paris Climate Accord that advanced countries would provide $100 billion per year over the last year, this year, coming years, and advanced countries have not delivered on that. I mean, these 100 billion are far from what is needed, but even that is not flowing. And that is now actually one of the critical points for the climate conference, the COP in Glasgow. So we do need international support, and we need, for example, international financial institutions, the World Bank, the multilateral development banks, to really provide much more finance in adaptation and resilience. Also, we need technical assistance. So I mentioned before that governments need to try to climate-proof their finances, that they need to deal with risk analysis and all that. This involves a lot of complexities, and many finance ministries, central banks, governments don't have the expertise to do this kind of analysis by themselves. They need to build this expertise. And that's, by the way, also what we at SOAS are involved in. We are currently working on developing a university network with universities in climate vulnerable countries to basically put these universities in a position to train not only the current and future generations of students, with the knowledge to do this kind of climate risk analysis, but also put these universities in a position to provide training to government officials. So, we don't want, international consultants to fly in to give a 5-day seminar and then kind of, everything is solved. We need to build the local capacities. That's really important. And we should be making some announcement on this university network at the COP in Glasgow. There are a lot of different things that should be happening on the international level. I mean, climate finance, I mentioned, technical assistance and training. We also need, and we've been working quite a lot on that, institutions like the International Monetary Fund, whose role is to govern international finance, to incorporate climate risks in their in their monitoring and surveillance framework. So in the annual Article 4 consultations, where they look at what are the risks and so on of the member countries. One very important point is also when conducting debt sustainability analysis, which the IMF and the World Bank do together, it's absolutely crucial to include climate vulnerability. So we need to have physical and transition risks being included in these debt sustainability assessments, because how can you look at debt sustainability if that's not included? And we also need to include crucial spending on adaptation, on mitigation, also investment in the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. All this needs to be included in these debt sustainability analyses. And I have been involved, and I think you mentioned that in your intro, in an initiative called Debt Relief for Green and Inclusive Recovery, where we're in many ways building up on the work I've just sketched out, where we're saying a lot of developing emerging economies already were had debt sustainability problems before the COVID crisis. But now the COVID crisis has worsened public finances even more. And so many countries that at this very point in time should be investing heavily, of course, in recovery, in addressing the health crisis, addressing the social crisis, but also very crucially, they should be investing in climate adaptation and resilience, because that is absolutely crucial for the development of their economies, and in many cases, the survival of their economies and societies. And with this terrible COVID crisis on top, we have a large number of countries, and UNDP estimates that these are more than 70 countries, but which are really in debt distress now, or going to be in debt distress soon. These countries are basically deprived of the opportunity to invest in everything they need to invest now, because they have no fiscal space. And so in that initiative, Debt Relief for Green Inclusive Recovery, we've put forward ideas how debt relief on a global scale for all countries, middle income and low income countries that need debt restructuring, could be engineered, providing this fiscal room for kind of the immediate recoveries, but also for the investment in climate resilience, in other areas of sustainability, which are absolutely crucial.
Well, thank you for that. I think that sort of covered all the areas of the priorities going ahead in terms of climate proofing, as well as the role of governments and across different sectors, but also the role of non-state actors that could potentially support the governments, like you said, through the university network, and quite possibly a perfect ending on the topic of recoveries, especially from the pandemic. So with that, I would like to sort of go off on a tangent, if I may, and have a couple of questions at hand here that I'd like to pose to you, with perhaps you could answer them in a fewer words, perhaps. So the first question is, would you fathom that there is enough contextualization being undertaken to the on-ground realities of the global South countries when international organizations design and implement climate finance interventions? Or do you feel that there is a disconnect between the problem that is being envisaged on paper as against the reality that we see in these countries?
Yeah, so I suppose I have two answers to that. So on the one hand, I do see that there's a lot of expertise in international development organizations, including World Bank and so on, and also a lot of very close cooperation with local governments, also local NGOs and so on. So there is a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge, and I think there has also been an appreciation that local context matters greatly, and I would think that there really has been a build-up of this local knowledge. So that is good. At the same time, I would say there's also a bit of a disconnect insofar as we have some major international goals. So, for example, there's been this kind of from billions to trillions agenda. Yeah? So, okay, let's mobilize private capital to flow into developing countries to support the sustainable development agenda, to support climate investment, all that. And this, I would say, hasn't been working at all. Kind of in theory, it sounds great. Kind of okay. Let's we have capital poor developing countries, that need to invest. We have a lot of private investment sitting in the financial centers of advanced countries. Let's match it. Let's use this private capital to bring it into developing countries, and then we can finance everything that needs to get financed. So in theory that sounds great, but in practice it's been less convincing. One is that the numbers just haven't worked. So there hasn't been kind of a billions to trillions. It's been really kind of billions to billions. So this big flow of private capital we just haven't seen. I mean, we have seen big flows of private capital, kind of portfolio capital into developing emerging economies over the last decade. But that, I would say, is actually now proving to be more a problem than part of the solution, because I was mentioning before that we now have quite a large number of developing countries that are having debt problems. And so the fact that quite a lot of private capital was flowing into these countries, and not necessarily in a very sustainable way, is now exactly leading to the situation we have. So I think we have to be, I don't want to be simplistic, and we shouldn't say that private capital flows into developing emerging economies are bad. They can be very good, they can be very beneficial, but for hoping that private capital flows would magically solve all the problems there are is kind of illusionary. And using public funds, so from international development assistance and so on, to de-risk these private capital flows, to kind of guarantee returns on private investment, but the losses are then shifted to the public balance sheet if something goes wrong. That doesn't seem quite, I mean, to me, that doesn't quite seem to be the right solution. Again, we should be nuanced regarding capital flows. Private capital flows can be very beneficial, but especially when it comes to the financing of public goods through private capital and public-private partnerships, the record is rather mixed, to put it positively. I mean, there's a lot of controversy on how good or bad public-private partnerships are, but I mean, my assessment would be that by and large, kind of many haven't been overly successful, and the problem is that at the end of the day, the risks end up with the public balance sheet, and that is to be avoided. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of good stuff happening at development organizations, international, and they can be very helpful. But not everything is really achieving the goal.
Thank you, Uli, for that answer. So I have one more question here before we move on to the question and answer session with the audience, which is related to the Center for Sustainable Finance, which provides a forum for interdisciplinary research on sustainable finance and investment. And here, the Rethinking Economics India Network the work is towards promoting pluralism in economics. It would be interesting to know what type and topics of research are being undertaken and whether interdisciplinarity plays a critical role in producing better research outcomes with reference to everything that we've spoken about today. And
yeah, well, so I mean, we indeed have an interdisciplinary approach. So the Center for Sustainable Finance is hosted by the Department of Economics at SOAS, and the Department of Economics itself has a very strong pluralist tradition. So we really try to teach our students different perspectives, different approaches, and so on. So the department and kind of the economics tradition at SOAS is very pluralist, and so also in this broader economics setting, we try to foster interdisciplinarity, but certainly also at the center. And at the center, we actually have members from across the entire university, so from all social sciences. So we don't have natural sciences, climate sciences at SOAS, but we also work with ecologists, climate scientists, and so on from other institutions, and so on. So we definitely do try to foster a multidisciplinary approach, and importantly, we conduct both quantitative and qualitative analysis, and whatever approaches we take really depends on what's the topic, what's the available data, what can be done, what should be done. So we're very open to that, and topics like climate change or also biodiversity loss, you can't approach from a very narrow perspective. You need to learn from other social sciences. You should kind of also natural sciences, and you really should be trying to work with the best people in these different areas. And that can generate very interesting results.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that answer as well. And now I think we could perhaps move on to the question and answer session from the audience. And looking at the questions received in the little question and answer box that we have on Zoom, I think right on top, we have the question from an anonymous participant who says that you had written on debt for climate swaps, which is an interesting concept. What would you say the pros and cons for developing countries are with respect to it? And what would be the impact of the debt cancellation on the lenders, and who will ultimately end up paying for the swaps?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, so indeed, so with colleagues, I've been working a lot on how to tackle this climate and debt crisis, and so when we talk about debt for climate swaps, we have really in mind a broader framework, so more a systemic solution. So historically, we have seen quite a lot of debt for nature swaps and so on, but they've been all very small, just a couple of million, 100 million or so dollars. And as I tried to explain before, what we're facing right now is really a systemic debt crisis in the global south, which 70 plus countries really, are possibly in the need of some sort of debt restructuring, debt relief. And importantly, we need this to happen fairly rapidly. So we can't, try to negotiate all kinds of small debt swaps, over the next couple of years, because historically many of these debt swaps have been quite time-consuming in the negotiations and so on. So what we're putting forward is really kind of a more systemic approach, where we say, okay, let's have a facility at the World Bank which could provide partial guarantees on debt that will be restructured. So the idea is basically that private creditors would agree on a substantial haircut, which would depend on the level of indebtedness and kind of whatever the debt sustainability analysis, taking into account climate and sustainability risks, would suggest. So private creditors would have to agree to this haircut, and they would swap their old debt at face value for new debt, which would would be, say, 60% or whatever of the old debt. But for that, the private creditors, for the new debt, they would get some credit enhancement, so a guarantee from this facility that we're proposing at the World Bank. And so the incentive would be for private creditors to swap, to kind of to trade in their old debt, which would have a high risk of default, for the new debt. And even though they get a haircut, the new debt would be safe in a way, because it would come with this guarantee from the World Bank. And so public creditors would have to take the same haircut as a private creditor, so there would be equality in treatment. And yeah, so that's kind of the idea in a nutshell. And countries, governments that would get debt relief would have to commit to some green and inclusive recovery plan, where they would basically draw on the existing national climate and development plans to pursue a couple of policies that they would do with this new fiscal space. So that kind of is the idea. And the important point about our proposal, we suggest it should not be a case-by-case approach. We need a framework that could then apply to all the countries that need debt restructuring, and also take away the problem that no one really wants to go first. Countries, governments are afraid to raise their hand and say, "Oh, I need debt restructuring," because they fear that they will get punished by the markets and all that. And having instead, kind of an overall framework where a larger group of countries could all go into that process at the same time, that would make more sense.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that definitely clarified things a lot. And to the person who posed the question, I hope that answered your question. So coming back to the question and answer box, the second most popular question seems to be, is, for example, cutting carbon emissions by 60% by 2030, within bracket, a good way to set goals for countries, or can we use better parameters for controlling climate change?
So first of all, I think we have to distinguish what countries are we talking about. So we have big emitter countries and we have small emitter countries. We have advanced economies and we have developing emerging economies. And the responsibilities for cutting emissions, are not the same. So clearly, advanced economies, they have to be more ambitious, and you can't demand from poor developing countries who haven't contributed to climate change to take as drastic action on mitigation as say the UK or Germany or the US or Japan, kind of these large rich countries. But we certainly need the advanced economies, but also, the large emerging economies to really move ahead. And here, in the emerging economy grouping, obviously we have China, which is the world's largest emitter. So we are absolutely depending on China to do the right thing. Luckily, we're seeing some positive signs from China. I mean, China has committed to achieving net zero by 2060. But hopefully this will be speed up. And China, has the technological means and also, I would say, the financial means to get this process started. Then, of course, we have India, which, has been, a more difficult discussion. India for sure has a lot of catch up to do. And so far, the government hasn't committed to a net zero timeline. I think it will be important for India to do that. But importantly, it will also be not only the right thing for the global climate and so on, but it will also be the right thing for India's economy. And I'll get back to that point in a moment. But then we also have other large emerging economies, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, where we also need to get the right climate policies on track. And in the case of Brazil, Indonesia, and certainly protection of rainforest is one of the really crucial aspects. And so when we talk about the transition, we certainly need to make sure that the transition pathways will help us to achieve the Paris goals. And for that, kind of what's being put in this question, cutting emissions by 60% by 2030, that I think is about the right ambition that we need to see from advanced countries, for sure. And now, I think what is important and what we really need to change is, we now basically are in a position to have a positive narrative on climate action. So in the past, climate action, climate mitigation, could be seen primarily as a cost to economies. Of course, it still is a cost. We need to put a lot of investment in there to make that happen. But the upside is also there. So investing in a low carbon, clean economy will create a lot of employment, a lot of clean growth, and very importantly, it can help foster development and help achieve various development goals. Yeah? And let's take the most obvious area, renewable energy. Yeah? So, we need to rapidly phase out fossil fuels, and we need to replace it with renewable energy sources. Now, if we take India, the argument has been, India can't afford to go clean because we have a lot of poverty, also energy poverty. We need to provide, we need to invest in cheap energy to support growth and development of India, and we can't be punished for advanced countries and others having caused all these emissions, and now we're supposed to rescue the world while we haven't been able to develop. And the good thing about this narrative is it's outdated. Coal is no longer the cheapest form of energy. Renewable energy is cheaper. And the technology is absolutely there to scale up renewable energy. In that process, the cost of renewable energy will come down further, even more. So we can use renewable energy to address energy poverty much better than we could do with coal. And of course, there are all kinds of collateral benefits if we switch away from coal to clean energy. Just, clean air is a very important one. And so we really can benefit in multiple ways, switching from fossil fuel economy to renewable economy. And then, also when we talk about, smart transportation, for example. I've also spent my fair amount of time in traffic jams in Mumbai or New Delhi. How much more beautiful would these cities be if there was smart public infrastructure and low carbon infrastructure, quality of life, air would go up, air pollution would go down, and all that. You can actually have much more sustainable approaches to development and enhance well-being, enhance prosperity. And so we need to get away from this notion, oh, climate protection is just expensive. It should rather be seen as, okay, let's leapfrog, investing in old energy infrastructure. Let's move to the latest, and the latest is clean and cheap. But there is one important issue, and that actually relates to what I was talking about before, the cost of capital. So the problem is that for developing emerging economies, the cost of capital is higher. And much of this kind of new infrastructure we need, be it renewable energy, but also, transport, public transport infrastructure, and so on. We need high upfront investment. And with high cost of capital, this is very problematic for developing countries. They can't afford, it's easy. If you invest in a coal-fired power plant, the upfront investment is lower. The overall, running the whole thing is much more expensive, but the upfront investment is cheaper. So that would be a rationale why you'd still want to go with that. And that's why we need public development banks, international multilateral development banks to provide this upfront capital to enable developing emerging countries to invest in the right solutions that are actually much more cost effective for them, but which they couldn't do without that international support. Sorry, I tend to give very long answers, but
no, I think that was perfectly put, especially in terms of energy dynamics, where we see that coal has already become unprofitable, where if we look at cases in North America or even in Europe, we see where not even through government policy, but just through market forces, coal has been phased out. So thank you for that answer. And coming back to the audience questions that we have, so I see that we've received one question, the most recent one, that says, thanks for such an insightful session. Another issue, one major issue that plagues developing nations is more often the lack of governance rather than the lack of required policies. And the person also asks, how can the nations deal with the issues of greenwashing?
Yeah, governance obviously is one of the big challenges in anything related to development. The sad truth is that you have some countries where you just have terrible governments, and which are much more interested in their own prosperity than that of the people. That, of course, is a very difficult situation, and I don't have any good answers on how to deal with that. But for example, my colleague Mushtaq Khan at SOAS, he's been leading some fantastic work on anti-corruption work, where they're looking very deeply at the political economy of corruption, because one thing there has been a lot of kind of simple solutions to addressing corruption, which just don't work. And, just saying corruption is bad, and, you should, try to rule it out, just doesn't work. You have corruption everywhere in every society. The important thing in a developmental context is to try to create framework conditions where you can set off positive developmental effects within a given framework. I mean, that sounds very abstract, but it's better to work within systems and try to adjust them gradually and help to achieve developmental outcomes than just kind of having this kind of very broad, we need to ban corruption and just too simplistic. Now, turning to this greenwashing question, I mean, clearly we have seen over the last couple of years this big boom in green lending investment. Everyone wants to go green, sustainable. It's become a huge market. Banks, capital markets, they're all now about green. And the problem, or kind of the result has been, of course, that everyone's now trying to portray themselves as green and sustainable. And we've actually seen, so especially in Europe, this has become such an important trend. And we've actually seen a lot of funds rebranding themselves into sustainable, green, whatever. ESG seems so. ESG is environmental, social governance criteria. And so a lot of rebranding without really fundamental readjustment of what they're investing in and so on. And this is a problem. And there are indeed voices who say, well, kind of ESG is actually very harmful now because we have all these ESG ratings, but having a good ESG rating doesn't mean that you are, for example, climate aligned, kind of Paris aligned. So ESG largely is kind of a best-in-class approach, which means that there are different ESG criteria for the E, the environmental, the S, the social, and the G, the governance. And so you have all these rating providers, which, by the way, have all different methodologies. So they also have all different, you can have ESG ratings which completely with completely different outcomes on all these individual firms. But you have a firm which has different ratings for various social criteria, for governance criteria, for environmental criteria. And then you could have, for example, a really well managed oil company, which has great governance frameworks, which has takes a lot of care about the social dimension, worker relations, God knows what. But they just happen to be an oil company and have a terrible emissions racket. But in overall, the overall ESG rating may actually not be as bad. And then they will be included in all kinds of ESG sustainability funds. And so we do have quite a lot of ESG funds with fossil fuel polluters in there. And a lot of investors who buy these, don't know that. They think, oh, I'm investing in ESG, I'm doing the right thing. And I mean, who has time to look at, what's actually in there? So that is a problem. And so we have all these investment managers who are now shifting huge amounts of money into ESG products. But many of these are not really, the underlying assets are not really sustainable. And so that is a problem. And that is why taxonomies are very important. So a growing number of jurisdictions has started to develop or implement green or sustainable finance taxonomies, which also, kind of define, what could be classified as green or sustainable. So, for example, the European taxonomy also has kind of a do no harm principle. So, kind of the underlying asset has to show some kind of positive impact on different environmental dimensions. But so you need to show some positive impact, but you also need to show that you're not actually having a negative impact on something else, kind of other ESG factors. And we're seeing more and more of these things. That's all imperfect, but I think it's important that we have kind of these green sustainable taxonomies, but I also very much believe and have been calling for having dirty taxonomies. So basically, clearly stating, what are activities that are very harmful to our economies, and I think that's very important because, to reach the climate goals, but also other sustainability goals, we absolutely need to boost green finance, sustainable finance. So we need to ramp up investment in, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, in other sustainability areas. So we need to scale up this green finance. At the same time, we need to very rapidly phase out all kinds of investment lending going into non-sustainable activities, dirty, harmful activities. And for this also, we need to define, what are the areas that really should not be financed anymore. So I think having a green taxonomy is great, but having a dirty taxonomy is at least as important.
Indeed, thank you so much for answering that question as well. And I think we have perhaps time for one more question. Is that so, Jaya?
Yeah, we can take one more for sure.
All right, so coming back to the Q&A box, I'm just taking a look. And all right, so we seem to have received a question that's from Adil Kamal, who says, how government bonds or corporate bond market, how the government bond or corporate bond market in reference to India can be broadened depth-wise for capital availability for these financing needs related to climate vulnerability or for the social sector?
Yeah, great question. So, obviously there has been, the rapid development globally now of the green bond market. There have been derivatives, so there's not only green bonds, there's also social bonds. There are sustainability-linked bonds, which are performance bonds. So they're linked to some, KPIs, key performance indicators, and the payments are then linked to the achievement or not of these. So, these are also growing in India, and that's good. I would say that it's also always important to realize that, say, green bonds by themselves, they are not the solution. So you can have a company that issues a green bond, and the use of proceeds then have to go into something green. So that's good. But the same company could still at the same time invest in, say, a coal-fired power plant or something. So a company issuing a green bond by itself is not green. And issuing green bonds may be part of a corporate strategy to become more green, but it is not always the case. Companies may just as well be motivated to issue a green bond because there is something that's called the green bond premium, the greenium. So basically, because everyone wants to buy green bonds, there's so much demand that the cost of issuing green bonds, is a bit lower than that of conventional bonds. So companies may just be motivated by issuing green bonds, because they want to benefit from slightly lower cost of capital, or because they just want to be seen as oh, we issue a green bond, we're green. But whether or not they really are green is another question. Same with sovereign bonds, sovereign green bonds. If a sovereign, as for example, just this week, I think, the UK, issued a sovereign green bond. This is largely symbolic, it's not that the UK government could not have issued a conventional bond, to finance whatever they are to finance. So it's largely symbolic. I mean, symbolism matters. So in that respect, I welcome the Indian government. I would welcome if the Indian government would issue green bonds. But we need to be aware of, what are the benefits or what are the limitations. Now, one thing where I have been working on quite a bit recently is, so we clearly need to scale up investment in sustainability. Larger corporations, governments, they can go through the bond market, conventional bond market or green bond market. But for many smaller corporations or also municipalities, that may not be an option. And so I've been working with some colleagues on how can we use fintech, so new digital financial technologies, to raise capital and link it to facilitate sustainable investment. And we've put forward a proposal for a blockchain-based project bond, where, so for example, a municipality could issue a bond that small-scale retail investors could purchase through their mobile phone. So we would use based on some crowdfunding technology, where people could buy through their mobile phone for relatively small value these project bonds. So you could, for example, from your local community, raise money to invest in whatever sustainable infrastructure project you want to finance. And through the blockchain, you could record all these transactions very transparently. You can record the incoming money. You can, during the construction phase, you can also record the progress of construction. You can record, where you spent the money. And that's quite important because in construction projects, a large portion, maybe a quarter or 30% often, goes into, it's basically corrupted. So you can create greater transparency on where do the money flows go. That doesn't mean that you can't misappropriate funds, but it's more transparent. But then also, once you have set up the project, you can use this blockchain for metering and billing. So you can again record very transparently the incoming flows, also expenditures. And so the whole project will be much more transparent, so you can basically harness community power to raise funds through digital technology, invest in these community projects, and you can combine investment from small-scale investors, but you could also have like larger investors come in because you can tokenize all this stuff, and then you so a lot of interesting opportunities that could be developed to really harness new technologies to facilitate investments that traditionally would not happen. And you can also, that could be also used for small and medium enterprises to invest in new technologies, increase their competitiveness and all that. So I think as much as we should be looking at development of capital markets, and in particular local currency bond capital markets, because traditionally a lot of developing countries would take on debt in foreign currency, which then is also causing all kinds of financial stability problems. So if you can use these new technologies to raise capital in local currency, I think that is very good, because going back to what we discussed before, kind of, relying on international capital, international private capital, to solve the problem, I think we can wait very long. So especially emerging economies need to try to better mobilize domestic capital, because what we're seeing is that we have actually, for the time being, huge capital outflows from developing emerging economies because people invest their money in safe assets in advanced countries. Often not at very good returns, because you don't get interest and so on if you invest in Europe or wherever. But people, there's a lack of safe assets to invest in, often in domestic economies. And if we can create, strengthen domestic capital markets through traditional capital markets, bond markets, but also through, these kind of fintech related project bonds that I just mentioned, that could be a way of strengthening domestic investment that could be used for sustainability, resilience linked investment, create returns for domestic citizens, and so in multiple ways kind of strengthen the economy. And I think we need much more work in that kind of area, because as I said, international capital can be helpful, but we haven't seen a single country yet which has developed only through external capital. Kind of domestic resource mobilization is really a very important part of development. And if we can find innovative ways of doing that, I think that could be very important, a contribution.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Uli, for this wonderful session. Unfortunately, I think we've run out of time now. So I'm going to have to put an end to this discussion. But if anyone in the participants would like to read up more, Jaya has put in a bunch of helpful links in the chat, which you can take a look at. And if I could just take a minute to say that the organization that I work with, which is called Climate Chance, also publishes annual reports on climate finance. I've put a link to the previous editions in the chat if you'd like to check it out. We also do other publications. And with that, I will stop and hand over the baton to Jaya. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you so much, Uli, for this session. It was very insightful. We have already gotten a bunch of great feedback on the fact that people learned a lot, not only about the what and the why and the how of the problem, but also a lot of insights in what could be some of the key solutions that global South economies could integrate going forward. So thank you so much for being with us for this session. This was a complete delight, and thank you so much, Tanya, of course, for moderating the session. For everyone else, thank you so much for joining and for the questions. This is one of the largest amounts of questions that we have gotten for any of the sessions, and the most amount of time that we have actually spent on Q&A in a session. So thank you so much for the questions. And again, thank you so much, Uli, for answering them so diligently. And for next, so this is the end of our day 3 of the Rethink Economics annual event, and also of our theme on better economics for climate change and biodiversity. We would be reconvening next week now on Friday with a session on funding the new economy, and then we would have our themes on global governance in the global south on the 2nd, and better curriculum reform in economics for curriculum reform in economics. I have putting a link for the session schedule for anybody to check out, and if you would like to join the rest of our sessions. Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jaya and Tanya, for having me. Really enjoyed this, and keep up the good work. And hopefully see you again sometime, maybe in person.
Definitely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you all. See you soon.